the loss this child has experienced is incomprehensible.
A massacre in Oklahoma with only one life spared. A father allegedly hunted down his wife and children one by one, killing the entire family with the exception of the youngest son.
3 of the children were murdered and 1 was left behind. I have never seen that before.
But why would the suspect leave behind a sole survivor?
Perhaps he came to his senses at the last minute and decided not to kill his son, or again, they had some kind of special relationship.
And what led up to the gruesome crime?
Because when you're talking about somebody who kills a spouse and then, systematically it appears, for a little bit we know, goes and murders 3 of his children, that to me is a different scenario than somebody who, out of anger, just immediately kills a spouse and then kills himself.
It was around 9:30 in the morning on April 23rd when dispatch in Canadian County, Oklahoma received a 911 call. The caller on the other end, a 10-year-old boy who'd woken up to find his entire family murdered. Investigators soon determined the shooter was the boy's father, 42-year-old Jonathon Candy, his mother, 39-year-old Lindsay Candy, and his brothers, 18-year-old Dylan, 14-year-old Ethan, and 12-year-old Lucas, had all been shot and killed.
My first thoughts were just how tragic and how unnecessary, the loss of all this life is.
That's clinical and forensic psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston. She says there are still many unanswered questions about the tragic crime.
You have these 3 young children who are, haven't even started their lives basically, who've been, murdered by somebody they should have been able to trust. So that was my first, I think, initial thought. And then I think I put my psychologist hat on a little bit more and just started looking at some of the dynamics. There's so much we don't know.
Investigators say the youngest son, whose name isn't being released for his privacy, was sleeping at the time of the murders. He was inside his room with the door closed and a box fan on, muffling the sound outside his door. Oklahoma officials say Jonathon hunted down and killed the children and his wife. 2 victim bodies were found in the home's upstairs and 2 more downstairs. Joni says she's never seen a crime like this before.
And I think the thing that's the most puzzling, and it'll be interesting to get more information, is the fact that there were 4 children, and 3 of the children were murdered and 1 was left behind. I have never seen that before. I've certainly seen situations when you had a child, for example, who spent the night with somebody, or you had children who were off at college, and so they were spared in that way. They just weren't home. But I really have never seen a situation where you have a parent murder part of the kids and leave 1 behind. And, I think there's a lot of different possibilities here, but I think we're going to need more information before we have maybe we'll never get the definitive answer, but at least have a better, more educated guess.
Ahead of the murders, those who saw Jonathon say everything seemed fine. He worked part-time with the Oklahoma City Thunder basketball team and was at the Thunder Pelicans playoff game just hours before the murders. But are there any sort of warning signs that friends or family seeing the perpetrator, Jonathon Candy, that they should have been picking up on?
Well, another puzzling part of this case appears to be that there's no indication of domestic violence. And we know that domestic violence, particularly when you're talking about murder-suicide involving a man and a woman or partners, domestic violence is a huge red flag. It's involved in about 70% of murder-suicides. And so oftentimes that's the number one thing that you see, which is not a huge surprise. Now, there's a couple of different possibilities. Sometimes people have a history of controlling behavior, verbal abuse, those kinds of things that doesn't reach to the level of law enforcement involvement or, a wife telling other people. And so it's possible that there was some warning signs that other family members or friends picked up. The other thing I think that I would be looking for, well, 2 things really. One, were there financial problems? Was there some crisis in the family, which is another risk factor for, murder-suicide, when there's a financial crisis in the family and the parent becomes so distraught that their thinking becomes distorted and they start feeling like the family can't survive this, which of course they could, but it's that distorted thinking. And then, depression, I think, is the other thing I'd be looking for, because we do know in murder-suicide that almost always suicide comes before murder, the thoughts. So the person is thinking about suicide, they're depressed, they're feeling hopeless, they're feeling helpless. And then for whatever reason, they begin to think about taking other people with them. And so I think whenever somebody is feeling, of course, by far most people who commit suicide do not take other people with them, but that's something to pay attention to.
Jonathon's family released a statement to local station KFOR reading, quote, "Our entire family has been left shattered and confused with so many questions we won't ever have answers to. Jonathon was the one whose jokes and goofy attitude kept everyone smiling. Aside from these events, his children and wife were his entire life." What's interesting is that leading up to the murder, his family said that there were no big red flags. Kind of as you said, things were pretty normal. And they've since released a statement basically saying he was just a goofy guy. They specifically said goofy. He liked to have fun with his family, joke with the kids, and they never saw this coming. So is it possible that it's something he was struggling with alone and never let it on to anyone else?
It absolutely is. I've read, and again, I don't have any firsthand knowledge that at least one of the neighbors had mentioned depression in reference to him. Now, I don't know what that means, but it certainly is possible. We know that there still is a stigma around getting help for any kind of mental health problem, and that is particularly true for men. And the other thing we know is when you look at depression in men is that oftentimes the signs and symptoms of depression don't appear the same way. Men are more likely to isolate, they're more likely to be irritable, kind of angry, and express things that way. And so even family members who are close to this person may notice this person's a little edgier, they're quieter, they're more secretive or whatever, but they're not laying in bed all day, they're not crying, they're not, talking about suicide, they're not seeking help, the things that we look for oftentimes when we're looking to see if somebody is depressed.
This is a Law&Crime legal alert. Google Incognito tracked users' browsing data without their knowledge. Mass Tort Alliance, one of our legal sponsors, is helping users file for compensation due to Google misleading the privacy of their incognito browser. If you've used Google Incognito anytime since 2016, you can start your claim in less than 10 questions at incognitoclaims.com/LC News. Is it possible that he didn't have any of those depression symptoms or feel that at all? He didn't have any suicidal tendencies, but something happened. We again don't know the motive, but something may have happened. He kills his wife and several of his kids and then just decides to kill himself kind of to get out of it.
One possibility, I mean, there's so many possibilities. And I think one of them that I've thought about is it's possible that he kills his wife in the heat of some altercation. They're having some argument, and he, for whatever reason, just loses it, shoots her several times, kills her. And that is not premeditated. And there is no history of depression or those things that we're talking about. And then starts thinking that I can't leave my kids to face this. I could not bear the thought of my children knowing that that I murdered their mother, their father is a murderer, or I'm going to kill myself, and I can't bear the thought of my kids being left with no parents. I will say to you that it's very rare, I think, for a murder suicide that involves children to come out of the blue, meaning it's certainly possible, I think, that he maybe had killed his wife out of rage or anger in that moment. But I would believe that there is some history of him thinking about depression, thinking about suicide, viewing his children as somebody who could not, either he could not be without, or they could not be without him. Because when you're talking about somebody who kills a spouse and then, systematically, it appears, from a little bit we know, goes and murders 3 of his children, that to me is a different scenario than somebody who, out of anger, just immediately kills a spouse and then kills himself. There's something there, but absolutely, I certainly do not want any family member to think there must have been some sign here and I should have seen it, because all of that could have been going on internally. It is very possible that nobody saw anything.
Authorities say there had been a fight at the Candy family home before the murders, but it's still unclear what a motive may have been, if the crime was premeditated, or why the shooter left one behind. I think this part is really the million-dollar question. Why leave behind this one 10-year-old boy? When the wife was murdered, 3 of the 4 sons were killed, and then the husband or father kills himself. Why leave behind just one sole survivor?
Well, I think an additional thing they'll probably be exploring as much as they can, because as you mentioned, that so many of the children are no longer here, is you try to get some information about perhaps family dynamics in terms of what was each parent's relationship like with each of the children. And that may be some clue. Did he have a special relationship with his youngest child? I mean, initially, it could be as simple as, he murders his wife and somehow the other kids hear this and they're calling out, or it could be a very simple explanation. Like this little boy, from what I've read, was in his room and the door was closed and there was a fan going. So, it could be as simple as this little boy didn't hear anything. And so he was lucky in that way that he didn't hear anything and that the other kids did hear something and they were calling out. Or it could be, like I said, that for whatever reason, he has a different relationship with his youngest child. And perhaps he came to his senses at the last minute and decided not to kill his son. Or again, they had some kind of special relationship. And for that reason, although I think that's, it's a very mixed thing, I'm sure, for this child, meaning, yes, you're the one who's left behind. You have your life ahead of you, and let the loss this child has experienced is incomprehensible.
So, what's next for the 10-year-old boy who survived the shooting?
They'll probably have a forensic interviewer who's experienced working with children at some point talk to this little boy, and that will, they may have family members involved, or a friend or something there to kind of help him with that. So that certainly is possible. They'll also be looking, though, at other things, such as, did this man purchase a gun recently? Looking at, did he talk to other people? Did anybody at work notice anything? So as part of the investigation, I think they'll be looking at a bunch of different avenues to try to sort this out. But I would not be surprised if they do talk to this little boy, certainly try to figure out what happened. And but I know they'll be very sensitive, and hopefully they'll be doing that in kind of a trauma informed way.
Joni says it may be a long road ahead emotionally for the one survivor.
Children tend to deal with things in baby steps, and they do it developmentally. So, I think certainly a lot of that will depend on his sort of kind of his support system that he has, his good friends, his extended family, people kind of rallying around him, not just now, but going forward. And, he's going to need kind of parent substitutes in a way to help and guide him. I'm sure he'll have that. And then I think, to the extent that he can get some kind of professional help, I think could be a very good thing. Although I think it's important, to somehow cue off this child as well. I mean, you don't want to force a child. They tend to grieve at the level they need to grieve at different points. And so with children, I think, a lot of times they seem to do fine, and they do fine, and then they hit puberty, and then they have to grieve in a different kind of way. Then they go through these milestones, birthdays, they graduate from high school. It's a grieving process, I think, that is ongoing. And I do think children survive these things. It doesn't mean his life is over or it's ruined, but I do think he's got a lot of tough times ahead. And again, I'm just hoping that, and I know that the support that'll be around him will help him. But I think it's just, again, I can't even imagine.
And I know we, as the public, are very interested in a motive because this case is very puzzling to leave the one child behind. But I'm wondering if the motive is also important to him. As you said, there are different ways to grieve. So maybe right now he doesn't need to know a motive at age 10, but maybe when he becomes a father himself, he'll want to know.
Yeah.
Do you think that will be important in his grieving or moving on process?
I think what will be important is coming to some kind of understanding. And, does that involve motive? Of course, he's going to look for a motive at some point. And you're right. I think that's such a very good point, because when people become parents, all kinds of things come up about our own parents. And so that may very well be a time when he really tries to understand that, or does understand that at a different kind of level. So I think what's going to be really important for him, I think, in terms of his healing, as it is for all of us when we lose somebody, particularly in a violent kind of way, is explaining it in a way that gives us some sense of peace or closure. So it may be that he ends up understanding that, he's never going to understand why his dad did what he did. Or it may be that he has memories. He talks to enough people at some point in his life where he feels like, I understand why my dad took that path. I could never condone it. Or again, it may be that I think he was not thinking clearly, and that's the best explanation. So I think he will be looking for that.
And honestly, this is a pretty open and shut case. We know all the victims, we know who the perpetrator was in the case. Again, we don't know the motive, but most of it is all confined in this one home as the crime scene. So moving forward, is a large investigation even really necessary?
I can't imagine that they'll do an extended investigation because, as you pointed out, it's an open and shut case from that perspective. I mean, from a psychological perspective, it's anything but. But from a crime scene perspective, it is an open and shut case. And I think they'll be much more focused on the surviving family and helping them move forward.
The boy's uncle has created a GoFundMe page for him, writing in an update on April 29th, quote, "We spent time with our family this weekend, and my nephew was able to be surrounded by love and thankfully some of his friends during this trying time. All the attention has made me reflect on the road ahead and what will happen when all of this attention goes away and what's left is the reality of the situation. I guess that's when the real work will start and the donations you are making now will be most meaningful for my nephew." In the end, Joni says that out of this tragedy comes an important reminder.
I think that, one of the things that's been somewhat tragic is that murder suicides have increased, over the past several years. And so I think it is important for us to just trust our gut. And if we're concerned about something in a loved one, to address it directly. It is certainly possible. And there have been plenty of times when there aren't warning signs. But if there are warning signs, or if there are things that you're seeing in your loved one that are uncomfortable, particularly if there's a history of domestic violence, for example, it is really important to get a second opinion or a third opinion. So you're making the best decision for you to be safe.
The 10-year-old boy is now staying with relatives. The GoFundMe page to pay for funeral expenses as well as a counselor for the boy has already raised more than $60,000. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.